Welcome to another episode of Cultivated from the CSE, high atop the Toronto skyline. I'm going to be joined by Taz Turner, the CEO of CordovaCann, an operator here in Canada. We're going to talk about his operations here, what he thinks about the US, and what the future may hold for cannabis here in Canada. Taz, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So CordovaCann has operations here in Canada. You've had operations in the US. Give us where the footprint is today of the company.
Sure. So today, CordovaCann has 10 retail stores, all operating in Canada under the Starbuds brand name. 8 of those stores are in Ontario and 2 are in Manitoba.
And of those, how are you finding the market? Because you've been in operation for some time. How have you found sort of the evolution and maturation of the market in Ontario and Manitoba? And has the sort of consumer behavior changed in those stores over the time that you've been open there?
Sure. So we launched our first store in June of 2020 in Ontario, and have grown from there all organically. I would say, it depended on which province you're operating in. So prior to this, we did have stores operating in Alberta and in BC, just a few stores there. And so each of those markets is different. Ontario is kind of our crown jewel. That's where most of our revenues and cash flow comes from. And I'd say, just in general, the markets have matured at kind of a similar rate, but depending on when they opened up. So Ontario is kind of one of the last ones to open up. So we were early in that market, got some good locations there. We were early in Manitoba as well, but obviously Ontario, with the population it has, can service more people. And so I'd say the evolution really from 20 to 22 was all about, more stores. And eventually, in the 22, 23 timeframe, there was at some point, I don't like the word saturation, but certainly probably got to a point where it was overserved, I guess is the best way to put it. And so we've seen a rationalization of stores, both from store closures and from acquisitions, but from a lot of store closures in the market, I'd say over the last 2.5 to 3 years. And so I don't necessarily think that the consumer has gotten any different over that time frame. We may have gotten more consumers over time, but really it's just a function of, like any business, it's blocking and tackling, servicing the customer first and foremost, focusing on inventory. Right, I think a lot of the stores in all of the provinces are under inventory. So we focused a lot on offering a broad assortment of product. And in a period of time, we were actually over inventory to try to take market share. And we think we've done a good job of that really over the last 4 years. I would say over the last year or so, this is relatively well known, you've seen a pullback in the consumer in the cannabis space, but obviously across the board in the consumer. So we are seeing that too, although we aren't seeing it at the level that the industry is seeing it. And we're just trying, to continue to get better in operating. And that means, in terms of driving margin, trying to take out costs where we can take out costs and trying to run the best business that we can.
Yeah. You announced, I think it was last year, that you were pulling out of some markets in the US, saying that those markets were more unpredictable and difficult to operate in than Canada. I guess that was good to hear from a Canadian perspective. I live in Toronto. Good to know that things in Canada are more predictable and less difficult to operate in than some markets in the US. But talk a little bit about that, because there's certainly been a lot of news in the US around rescheduling of medical cannabis. There's some hearings coming up in June and July about rescheduling of adult use. Are there pillars that might happen in the US or factors that might happen in the US that might make it interesting for that market for you and the company? Or is it really, we're focused on Canada now and doubling down on sort of what we're doing here? Or maybe there'll be situations where you might look again into US markets?
Sure. So we started in the US. CordovaCann first entered its first market in the US. And actually at one point in time, it was in 5 different states in the US. And, I started investing, I got involved in the cannabis space as my background as an investor in 2012. So originally, in starting CordovaCann, I would have been shocked if you told me that we still wouldn't be at, federal, legalization in 14 years. So we took a calculated risk to get into those markets. And quite honestly, even still, I hear from U.S. operators saying it's actually not getting any better. It may not be getting any worse, but it's not getting any better from a management perspective, right? Whether that be banking, whether that be compliance, because you're shut out of so many different programs, software companies, banks. And so we made the difficult decision about 18 months ago, maybe even 24 months ago now, to start winding down the U.S. operations. Those operations were great at times, but were also difficult at times. And I would say that the amount of management time spent on those operations relative to what we are getting out of them, it didn't make a lot of sense. So while it pained me to do it, I think it was the right move. And then to answer, so that's where we went on the U.S. market. We now, as of almost a year ago exactly, so our fiscal year ends in June. As of last June, we were out of the U.S. completely. And so, to get to the second part of your question, does it affect our business and would we ever get back in? I don't think it affects our business a ton in terms of the rescheduling in the U.S. I do think it affects it from the standpoint of it opens up banking relationships there, which then in turn probably opens up the entire banking market, meaning in Canada as well. Because as you probably well know, the Canadian banking market isn't actually all that open, despite it being federally legalized. And so I do think just from that standpoint, it does start to get better. For us, just not at the same value that it would have had if we had still had U.S. operations. And I guess to answer the last part of your question, I say never say never. The running joke internally was that the day that we decided to get out of the U.S. was the day that they were going to, federally legalize. Obviously that hasn't been happening, but they are seeing, we're seeing some movement. I think given the scar tissue that I have in just cannabis in general for waiting for things to happen, my gut is that, it'll still be slow moving here. It'll obviously be forward progress, but it'll still be slow moving. And so my guess is that we will have, opportunities to move back in. The question is when, and honestly, the question is value as well. I mean, a lot of the struggling operators in both the U.S. and Canada have been eliminated over time just from closures. And so, in my way of thinking about it, it's purely an economic decision. So if we can get something that is attractive, that's accretive to our business, and that obviously serves the greater mission of our business, then we would get back in. I don't think you'll see us doing that though in the short to medium term in the next 12 to 18 months. We have a lot on our plate on what we can do growth wise in Canada.
And that's actually where I want to sort of go next, because you've talked about growing organically and with accretive acquisitions here, and you talked about sort of on the Canadian landscape. Like, what does that look like for you? And do you think there'll be opportunities in that same time horizon while the U.S. is sort of doing its thing? But looking on the Canadian landscape, whether it's in Ontario, Manitoba, or other places here in Canada where you're looking to grow, and again, either organically or with accretive acquisitions of people that are looking to get out, or really good locations, or really good operators. Like, how does that look on your plate right now?
Yeah, we've been saying for a long time that we want to expand via acquisition and of course organically, but expand via acquisition, particularly in Canada and specifically in Ontario. And we are, down the road on that path. We've probably been saying it for longer than we'd like to say it, but we've, given the exit from the U.S. and some structural changes that we've made internally, we are finally at that point with which we can go down that path. We also, our investors are a pretty close-knit group, and we've been able to, it's not been easy, but source, some debt financing to do that, because that makes the most sense. And quite honestly, when you're able to source some debt financing at the multiples that we're looking at via acquisitions, it becomes very, very attractive and accretive to the overall business. Again, similar to, like I said, in the U.S., that I'm shocked it is taking this long for any sort of rescheduling to happen. I'm also probably equally as shocked that the Canadian market has stayed as stagnant as it has from a multiple standpoint and the opportunity standpoint to make acquisitions. I like to tell people in my financial community, because I like I said, I have a history as an investor, that I think I'm buying very good operating and in many cases nicely growing assets at distressed multiples. It's just a lot of these operators that are owning a store or 2 or 3 stores are tired. And they, it's a lot of work, given the fact that you're, whether it be employee turnover or whether it be, inventory struggles and dealing with the regulators. There's a lot of reasons that people are tired and saying, I'd like to be part of something bigger. And so we're seeing a lot of those opportunities. And quite frankly, those opportunities have existed for probably the better part of 2.5, 3 years. And I'm excited that they're still there because we're finally making some moves to go after them.
Right. I want to double back to something you said because I like to underscore it when I'm talking to folks in the U.S. around the cannabis landscape there, that even if rescheduling happens to medical cannabis, which it has, even with adult use, even I would say with even more normalized banking, like you're talking about a country that has all these things already, and you still talked about really good assets at distressed prices. Like I think there's this sense in the U.S. that if these 3 things change and banking becomes more normalized and maybe they can take credit cards and rescheduling happens, that all of a sudden a switch is going to be flipped and the whole landscape is going to change. We've seen that here in Canada. That doesn't actually happen, and that there is a runway where the situation is exactly what you're talking about, where Ontario has been open since 2020. And, we're 6 years in, almost to the, almost 6 years exactly. Right. Like, is that, I don't know if it's a cautionary tale, but do you think U.S. operators don't know how difficult it's going to be, even if these dominoes fall?
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of saying it, right? I think that the public perception, right, of people that haven't been through this, the public perception is, everything's going to change and we're going to start to see a wave of M&A activity. But and I probably don't like to say it this way, but it's the truth, right? We're burdened by those that came before us, is what I always like to say, right? And so in Canada, it was a craze, right? I was part of that, when everybody was talking about what this could be. And I remember back in 2012, 2013, 2014, investing in these companies when they were traded on the public markets at $20 million, $25 million valuations. And then literally they'd come back 18 months later with no change in their business model and be valued at $1 billion, right? Looking for the same sort of investment. And so, unfortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, I thought that was going to, that would be exposed at some point. It took a little bit longer than I thought it would. But the reason I say all this is not to throw stones, but really is to say that a lot of people that have invested in this cannabis market over the last 10 plus years have been burned, right? And another thing I also like to say to people is, if you told me what was going to happen to this market, back in 2017 when CordovaCann was founded, I would say there's no way that we'll be in business. It just won't happen. But, I think we focused on, keeping a cap table where everybody is treated the same. And we focused on just execution, right? If you can generate cash in this business, you can stay in business. And so while we haven't been as happy about our ability to grow as quickly over the last 3 years, partly due to, the regulatory environment, partly due to the banking situation, we are still in a position to do that. And with a lot of the competition has faded away. And so those opportunities are still there and we're excited about it. So, I've deviated a little bit from your point, but I completely agree with it. I think that this, while it helps and it'll be incrementally beneficial, I don't think it changes the game substantially in the near term and probably not in the medium term.
Yeah, it's an industry not for the faint of heart.
That's well put.
Let's say that's an easy.
I always say I would have if you told me what I was going to get into back when I got into it, there's no way I would ever get into it. So,
no,
but I'm here. We're on the other side, and we just got to, continue to go forward because I think this can be something big.
But think of all the lessons you've learned and take all the lumps you've taken, right?
Yeah,
it's a growing experience. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I want to think about sort of a forward-looking, which I know not everybody always wants to talk about, but we've talked about the past 6 years, right? So, it's even from June 2020 to May of 2026. Think about May 2032. And what it might mean for CordovaCann or even the industry overall here in Canada or broader. Like, do you think we'll be having conversations much like now, or like banking isn't really normalized here or there in the US? Like, what do you think the conversation will be like 6 years hence? Or will it be like any other industry 6 years hence and we'll be having conversations just like anything else?
My hope is, and I do really believe that, 6 years from now, which is a long time, that it'll be like any other industry, right? I do think that It'll take time for multiples to get back to normal. I do think it'll take time for banking regulations to get normalized. But my gut is a lot of the Canadian issues from a regulatory and commercial standpoint stems from the issues that are driven by the United States, because there's so much connectivity there. And so I do think as the reins are loosened a bit in the US, it'll help in Canada. And so my gut is that, in our particular business, we're just in the retail business. We'll become just another retailer, a specialized niche retailer. And honestly, that's the way we've tried to run this business from, since we got into it back in 2020. And so, we're making measures where we're using, AI and some other things. You wouldn't think of it to be used in a cannabis store, but we're using some of these things to actually, basically make our stores run more efficiently, and therefore driving a bit of margin, because we do think that these things are going to matter in 6 years. Not that they don't matter now, but they're going to matter even more as the market becomes more of a widget retailer, just like any other market. And so, yeah, my thought is it gets better for everyone, it gets more normalized, and yeah, we're just a retailer just like any other niche retailer.
Well, we'll schedule that now for 6 years hence. No, we'll talk to you.
Happy to do it.
We'll talk to you in between now and then, but I really appreciate you taking time today.
Thank you so much, Jay. I really appreciate it.
You got it. That was Taz Turner, the CEO of CordovaCann. I am Jay Rosenthal from Cultivated. Find everything we do at cultivated.news. And once again, thank you to the CSE for having us here today.